Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first installment of the Second Thursday Conversations, sponsored by the Greenville County Democratic Party. Many of you know me, but for those of you who do not, my name is Elias Valentin II, but everybody calls me Eli. I have the honor of serving as the chairman of the GCDP, and on behalf of our entire leadership team, comprised of our wonderful vice chairs, Ruth Todd, Sharon Garrett, and Jonathan Sweeney, our amazing volunteer network, and all of the great Democrats across the county of Greenville, thank you for engaging with tonight's event. Our goal as a team is to have conversations which challenge us into action. On the second Thursday of each month, the GCDP will be sponsoring various topics, and we invite you to join each and every month to hear about the issues that matter, those that are impacting folks in our community, in their daily lives, and those issues in which our party can continue to seek progress. We must be the change we want to see in Greenville, and we know people in Greenville are seeking that leadership. We're going to cover a variety of topics, but today's topic, is so important. We're excited to kick off 2021 with two phenomenal panelists who will not only enlighten us, but illuminate us on issues surrounding gerrymandering and redistricting. I know our presenters will give you a deeper dive and understanding into the topics and how we can get engaged as local citizens and use our voice as voters in our democracy. But here's a quick rundown of what we can expect for tonight. You might ask, what is redistricting? Quick synopsis, because we have an expert, true expert on the panel that's going to do a presentation. Redistricting in the United States is our process of redrawing the district boundaries. In 1967, a congressional act required that representatives be elected from single-member districts, except when a state has a single representative, in which case that's usually a statewide seat. Example, Liz Cheney in Wyoming, who stood up and was pretty brave to call for impeachment this past week. And what is gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is as old as our national government. Patrick Henry gerrymandered James Madison's district in 1789, trying unsuccessfully to engineer his defeat in our very first congressional election. The term gerrymander was coined in 1812 by a journalist angered at the bizarre districts drawn by then Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry to ensure his party had a majority in the state legislature. He thought one district resembled a salamander. The gerrymander was then born. Funny story, Gerry winded up serving as Madison's vice president. Today, we have two esteemed panelists, which you all know are some of the hardest working women we have in Greenville County. We want to welcome Representative Chandra Dillard, who's coming straight from session. She's working tirelessly for Greenville County and District 23 as the Honorable State House member in our State House. We also are so honored to have Lawson Wetli, the co-president of the local chapter of the League of Women Voters. I'm going to give you a quick overview of tonight's conversation, and then I want to turn the floor over to Lawson, who will provide her expertise through a presentation on the basics. I then am going to turn it over to Representative Dillard and talk to her and get her opinion on how it will work in the General Assembly. She's intricately involved and has been involved in the redistricting process back in 2010. We'll then bring both panelists together to discuss some broader issues and answer questions from you all as the engaged participants of this panel. I want to thank you again, and I want to get right to it. I want to introduce the wonderful and brilliant co-president of the Greenville County League of Women Voters. I want to make a really important disclaimer. Lawson is here representing the League of Women Voters in a nonpartisan fashion. We appreciate her knowledge, her time, and her expertise, but also her love for educating people all over this state. Lawson, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eli, and thank you to everyone who's here taking your time to listen about gerrymandering of all topics, which I find exciting, and I hope you will too, but not everyone does. To Laura Haight for making it possible. I'm now going to share my screen, and let's see, let's just make sure this is going. Can everybody see the presentation? Okay, I will assume that that is a yes. So as Eli mentioned, I am here in my capacity as a representative of the League of Women Voters of Greenville County, and we are a nonpartisan organization that focuses on voter education and voter empowerment. And our focus on redistricting reform is one of many examples of the efforts that we're making to make everybody's vote count and to put voters in the driver's seat. The particular name of the League of Women Voters push for fairer maps is People Powered Fair Maps. That's our campaign name. And as Eli mentioned, my goal today is to really talk about the basics, to do a redistricting 101, where the amazing Representative Dillard can then fill in more details about how the rubber hits the road in our very own state legislature. One housekeeping point that I want to mention is that in proof that I am a total and complete dork, I made a resource sheet, and there's going to be a link. There is a link to it to make it available online that has lots more and more detailed information about redistricting that I will drop in the chat if it hasn't already happened by the time that I'm done. So with that said, I always like when I'm listening to a presentation to know what's the point here? What am I supposed to get out of this? And what I want you to get out of this is first to understand by the end of this what redistricting and gerrymandering are, to see what the problem is here in South Carolina, and most fundamentally to know what you can do about it if you're so inclined. So the first question that we're going to ask is, what is a district? If redistricting is redrawing the lines, what are districts in the first place? What a district is an area where voters are grouped together to elect their political representatives. And those groupings can be large ones. This is a map of the 7 districts that our state is carved into for US House representations. Those are quite large districts, but they can be pretty darn small. And this is a map of the 4 districts in Greenville City Council. But the key thing is that the goal of a district is to put us together so we can most effectively elect someone to represent us in government. And those districts, of course, are divided by lines. The lines determine who votes where, the voters decide who represents them, and those representatives make the laws that affect so much of our daily lives. And I want to emphasize, this is the direction that the control is supposed to go in. It is supposed to be the case that voters are choosing their representatives, who then can effectively represent those voters in the government. And a key problem when it goes awry, as it does with gerrymandering, is that instead of voters choosing their representatives, representatives are choosing their voters and have less incentive to listen to us, to care what we think. It makes our votes matter less. Why do we have legislative districts? For one thing, we're required to. The US Constitution originally required that the House of Representatives be divided into districts based on equal population size. And at this point, through judicial decisions, that applies to just about all political districts that we have. So it is a constitutional requirement. Examples of the way that that looks, districts based on population size. Here you can see 2 different districts, US House districts from South Carolina. The 6th Congressional District is represented by Jim Clyburn. The 1st Congressional District is the one just won by Nancy Mace. So they're very different geographic sizes, but in both cases, they're based on equal population sizes of around 700,000 people. Here's another example. This is the map of the South Carolina State House seats. Again, they are different geographic sizes, but they're based on similar population sizes. So that's the key. One key requirement is districts should have the same population. That is the constitutional requirement. I also want to highlight that there are practical reasons for districts, and it's that it makes our voices be heard more clearly. So imagine if in South Carolina, We made all of our decisions based on a statewide popular vote, instead of having districts, instead of, dividing us up. What you would find is that in all cases, the majority vote would win and the minority would lose. And think about that along a bunch of different axes. So if there's a racial majority, racial minority, and people vote along racial lines, that means that the racial minority never gets its way, never gets any say at all. Also, you can think about it in terms of other kinds of interests of various communities. Like here in the upstate, we have some particular interests like, I don't know, international trade that are important to us. In the coast, they're going to have some other interests, that are more important to them. Unless we have a grouping of people with similar interests to ourselves, we're not going to have our voice heard as effectively. So there are legal requirements for districts, but also districts serve a very important practical purpose of making our voices, ideally, be heard more effectively through our representatives. We redraw those lines every 10 years. That's what redistricting is. Why do we do that? Again, we have to, and it's a good idea. So the we have to part is that the Constitution requires that we have a census every 10 years. I'm sure y'all probably heard about the 2020 limping through in COVID era census that has been tied up, but the data is not ready yet. The year after the census, all of that census data goes into redrawing the lines. So it's required, you have to have a census, and then you have to redraw the lines again. Also, it serves a very important practical purpose, because if you don't have a requirement of redrawing the lines, the districts are no longer going to be equal in population. People are born, people die, people move. You have to have a mechanism for redrawing the lines or redistricting, or else you start missing out on the purpose of districts in the first place. At its most basic, what is redistricting? It's redrawing those district lines as required every 10 years. And guess what? It's happening this year. 2021 is a year of redistricting. So for years now, I've been giving this redistricting reform presentation, and it's been focused on like, hey, we need to change the rules, which we do, and that's a long-term goal. This year, though, there's a real rubber hits the road element because the actual redistricting is happening, and we need to be paying attention. I'm now going to get into the what's the nature of the problem part of this presentation, and it focuses on who redraws the lines. Well, in South Carolina, like in most places, it is our state legislature who is redrawing the lines for their own seats and also for the US House seats. So what's happening is that exactly the people who have the most to gain or to lose in terms of how those district lines are drawn, because it affects whether they're going to have an easier or harder shot and whether their party is going to have an easier or harder shot, are exactly the people in charge of the process. And I want to emphasize, this doesn't make them bad people. This isn't about good and evil in my view. It's about self-interest combined with power to make that self-interest happen. So that's what we have going on. That is the core of the problem, that the foxes are guarding the hen house. The people who have the power to draw the lines are exactly the people with an incentive to draw them in a way that benefits themselves. What is gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is what comes from self-interest plus power. It is redrawing the lines with the purpose of helping yourself and your own party, with the purpose of hurting other candidates, the other party. I like to think of it, just because for me, it just helps to keep it kind of simple. Gerrymandering is selfish redistricting. It's making redistricting decisions in a way that is selfish for yourself and your own party. And again, the impact of it is to make our votes matter less. How does gerrymandering play out in South Carolina? Generally speaking, gerrymandering means that there's a disconnect between the population of, an area, a district, a state, and the representation. So generally speaking, and this has been true for several years now, and it was true in 2020, our state's voters tend to break down to be about 55% Republican, about 45% Democratic. However, That is not the level of representation that exists in our US House members or in our state legislature. So now that Nancy Mace won that seat, it is again true that 6 of the 7 US House members from South Carolina, which is 80+%, are Republican, and only, I think it's 86% Republican, 14% Democratic. Again, as opposed to a 55-45 split. If you look at our state legislature, it's less egregious, but it's still a real disconnect where about 2/3 of the state senators and of the state House members are Republican compared to 55% of voters. I'm going to take a moment to kind of run through the nuts and bolts of how gerrymandering happens. And you're going to hear some fun terms like cracking and packing. So in all of these examples, what we have is a situation where there are 5 different districts, and they are divided into red and blue, where red voters represent 40% of the voting population and blue voters represent 60%. So if you're going to have proportional representation, which is generally a good idea, I would argue, you're going to end up with 2 red representatives and 3 blue ones. That reflects that 40-60 split. One way, because at the end of the day, again, gerrymandering is about helping yourself, hurting the other one. So if you want to hurt the other side, if you want to make their votes matter less, one way to do that is cracking. And what that means is splitting the disfavored party into districts such that they're gonna lose way more districts than they should. So if you look at that center example, what you'll see is that clearly Team Blue has had the reins in the map drawing process, and they have cracked the red population such that they are 40% of the overall population. They're also 40% of each of the 5 districts. So even though they're 40% of the population overall, they're going to get no representation whatsoever. Blue is going to sweep it all. Looking to the example on the right-hand side, to cracking, you can add packing. What packing is stuffing as many voters of the disfavored party into a few districts as possible. So they're going to win those districts by overwhelming margins, but that means they're wasting votes too. If you're winning by more than you need, those are wasted votes that could go to electing representatives in other districts. And so if you see on the right-hand side, there's 2 kind of backward C districts. Blue voters have been packed into those districts. They're going to slam dunk it. Those are super safe districts for Team Blue, but the remaining blue voters have been cracked into 3 other districts where they're the minority. And what ends up happening in this scenario is, even though blue voters are 60% of the population, red gets 60% of the representation. Clearly, Team Red was at the helm. And when you think about the problem of gerrymandering these days, if you combine cracking and packing and incredibly complicated computer algorithms, you can end up with a situation where you have a minority of the population that can get a lock on majority control of the power, which is so fundamentally contrary to our lowercase d democratic system, right? That's dangerous, dangerous stuff. And that's one of the many things that we, the League of Women Voters, thinks it's important that we avoid. By the way, just one local example of cracking that might resonate for y'all is we're pretty close to Asheville, North Carolina, which generally speaking, the population of Asheville itself, I believe, tends to vote more Democratic. Well, with Republicans in charge of the North Carolina state legislature, they split Asheville into different congressional districts, such that all of those Democratic voters in Asheville are subsumed into districts in which they are a minority in a broader Republican district and thus get no representation. And North Carolina historically has been an especially extreme example of gerrymandering where, and I didn't check to see what happened in 2020, but in 2018, even though they're about a 50-50 state in terms of how people vote, 10 of the 13 seats were held by one party, the Republican Party, because Republicans had been drawing the lines. What I just went over is examples of partisan gerrymandering to help or hurt a political party. Another kind of gerrymandering is the kind that is supposed to protect an incumbent. And by the way, we in the league in South Carolina have done research and have reason to think that this is actually a more common form of gerrymandering than the partisan kind here. And again, it makes sense if you just think about self-interest. If you're an incumbent, you want it to be easy to get reelected. But that's exactly what is not in your constituents' interest. They want, we the voters, we want competition. We want choices. So looking at the left-hand example, you can see that an incumbent is trying to draw district lines to make their district contain more Team Blue voters and fewer Team Red voters. This will make it easier for a Team Blue politician to get reelected. Note, this is also packing, right? So it's sort of in an incumbent's interest, but not necessarily in their party's interest. But it's the actual incumbent who has the ability to draw the lines. If you look at the right-hand example, which I thought was crazy, but it actually happens, you have incumbents draw districts specifically to exclude up-and-coming competition for themselves. So somebody wants to run against them, they can draw the lines to cut that person's house out of their district. And again, if you're the incumbent, that's in your interest. But that's the opposite of what's good for voters. For voters, you want those up-and-comers to come and challenge. It keeps everybody on their toes and it gives you more choices. So here again are examples where gerrymandering helps incumbents or helps parties, but it hurts voters. One thing that I do want to take a moment to highlight, I've been talking about redistricting for quite a number of years now. I'm not exactly an expert, but I'm a very interested layperson. And one thing that I hear all the time is, oh, well, you know, majority minority districts, I mean, that's just gerrymandering too. No, it's not. Again, gerrymandering is selfish redistricting. It's intended to help or hurt a political party, a political candidate. Things like minority majority districts are required by the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because it is crucial to our democratic system that ethnic minorities, racial minorities, language minorities be given a fair opportunity to elect a candidate that will represent their own interests. So I just want to highlight that because that's something that comes up for me all the time. Creating or sustaining a majority minority district is not gerrymandering, is not a problem. In fact, is really important, is required by our Voting Rights Act, and is something that we, the League of Women Voters, emphatically support, as I hope we all do. Looking at the system overall, what we see is that the people who are controlling the game are the people who are interested in helping or hurting their party and themselves. One thing that this ends up meaning is when people gerrymander to help their party or to help themselves, they make a safe district, a district in which it's going to be very hard for anyone to come and unseat them. What does that mean? It means a lot of times you don't get competition at all. So this map shows South Carolina State House districts from 2016. And the ones that are shaded in yellow are ones where there was a major party challenger. Look how few of them there are. It was fewer than 30% of the seats in 2016. And a similar number, 33% in 2020. A lot of these seats are just purely uncontested because the districts are so safe. And another part of the problem is if you get a challenger, it's likely if a seat is safe for your own party, if you get a challenger, it is going to be from your own party and it's going to be in the primary. One thing that you guys probably know is that voter turnout in primaries is a lot lower than in general elections. It's generally about 15% compared to, much higher in a general election. So it's a lot fewer voters, and those voters tend to be more extreme. If you have a lot of the seats only challenged in the primary, then you have a tiny minority of South Carolina's voters choosing who's representing all of us in state government. In fact, in 2016, and this blows me away, fewer than 9% of South Carolina's voters elected over half of our state legislature. So that's just another way in which things end up not being truly representative at all. And again, it ends up being more extreme. If you only have to worry about people from your own party, you're going to worry about people coming from the fringe. If you're a Republican, you're looking over your right shoulder for someone even more extreme coming after you. And same for Democrats, you're going to look over your left shoulder. Well, if everybody's only worried about the fringes of their own parties, how are they going to come together to govern when they're in government at all? If there's no incentive to cross the aisle, how is anything going to get done? So a lot of people think that the hyperpolarization that happens is one of the many bad things that comes from gerrymandering. Here's what I think is a recent local example of this. What I've set out here is the 7 districts, US House districts that come from South Carolina. Districts 1 through 7, I've color coded them red for where there was a Republican victor and blue for where there was a Democratic victor. And the numbers here are the victory margins from 2020. So this was how many percentage points ahead they were than their like next closest competitor, which was in all cases their major party challenger. And what you'll see is in every instance but one, it was a blowout. What we have in South Carolina are incredibly safe seats for our US House members. Looking at those Republican representatives who were just elected in November, one thing that struck me last week was when there was that vote about whether or not to object to the certification of the election results. Did y'all notice? Out of the 6 Republicans, 5 of them objected, only 1 didn't. Nancy Mace, the only one from a competitive district. Now, I'm not reading her mind. I don't know exactly why that happened, but also if you know you have a real shot at losing and you need to like cultivate all the goodwill you can, that's one reason not to act crazy. Similarly, by the way, I was struck, as many were, that District 7's Tom Rice was one of the few Republicans to vote for impeachment. All of the news coverage, and he's clearly from a safe district, like he wasn't worried about that. All the news coverage that I saw about this was, everybody knows he's going to lose the primary in 2022, right? Like that's what he has to worry about, is somebody from the extreme coming to boot him because he voted his conscience in this one instance. Or I'm not here to say that he doesn't vote his conscience in other interests, but you know, in this case, he made clear he was voting his conscience, but against his political interest. So what's the problem with gerrymandering? At its core, just to sum up, our elected officials are drawing the lines for their own districts. They have an incentive to advantage themselves and their own parties, and the resulting gerrymandered lines take away power from voters, make our voices and our votes count less, and it makes polarization worse. What can we do? Okay, it's a problem. What can we do about it? Well, here in South Carolina, for the most part, a lot of our roads to reform lead through the state house. If you've seen news about states where they're doing cool stuff like voters bringing in redistricting reform, you can pretty much guarantee that they have an ability that we don't have in South Carolina. We in South Carolina can't do citizen referendums on the ballot. We can't do state constitutional amendments without it going through the state legislature first. Everything has to go through the state legislature for the most part. And again, they're the ones in charge of drawing the lines. They're the ones with the least incentive to change it. We also know, we had hoped for a while that federal courts would step in to help, but our hopes were dashed in 2019 when the US Supreme Court decided, nah, not to do it. So that's the bad news piece of that. There's some good news piece, which is that as of January 2021, there's some real hope that there could be federal law to make a real difference in this. There was a bill in the prior Congress that I believe passed in the House, but wasn't even considered in the Senate, called, I think, the For the People Act, which included very fulsome gerrymandering reform. So if that is something that the current Congress decides to approve and that the Biden administration signs into law, there's some real hope for that. So that is an avenue that we now think is possible. What can we do? Well, long term, we really do need to change the rules. The rules need to be fair, just that apply to every redistricting that ever happens. And changing the law, we specifically think means requiring that district lines not be drawn to try to help or hurt a party or an incumbent, and have an independent commission that's going to draw the lines in the first place. But for me, I like to know, what can I do now In 2021, when the actual redistricting is going to happen, and Representative Dillard is going to be giving us some great information about that, what we really need is to be focused on that process, which I believe is likely to happen this upcoming summer. And we need that map drawing process to be open and transparent, and we need avenues for public input. What can you do? And P.S., I'm not assuming you necessarily want to do anything. I think for all of us who want to make civic changes and want to make what we think to be a positive difference in the world, like, we only have so much energy, we only have so many things we can focus on. But this is something I care about. I hope you do too. And if you do, what you can do is contact your state legislators. Let them know that when they start drawing those district lines or approving the district lines that their committees have drawn, you want to make sure that those lines are not drawn to advantage a party or an incumbent. You can also contact your federal legislators and urge them to pass fulsome, redistricting reform, something like the For the People Act. Also, you can connect with us. We, the League of Women Voters, are going to be very focused on this. And this is one of many examples where there's no business interest that's going to be following this. This is purely like either voters and organizations like the League of Women Voters are watching this, or nobody is watching this. So you can connect with us. We have a blog that you can sign up for. We're going to be creating events, educational and other events. You can follow the League of Women Voters of South Carolina Facebook page. There are links for that in that resource sheet. But that's another thing you can do, is just start following along. Later this year, this summer, when the actual redistricting is happening, you can help shine the light on the redistricting process. That's one of the focus of our attention is one of the most important things that we can bring to this. And I do want to mention, a lot of the focus is always on congressional redistricting, state redistricting. We're going to have redistricting of county districts, city districts, all kinds of districts, and those are incredibly important too. So whatever redistricting it pertains to you and your community, you can pay attention, you can shine the light. Here we are, it's 2021, redistricting is happening this year. The map rooms are ready. We want to swing those doors open, we want to shine the light in, and we want to protect our interest as voters. And thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Lawson. And as you all know, if you've ever sat through Lawson's presentations, it breaks it down in a way that's so palpable. You can feel everything that she's saying, and it's doable. And I think that's what we want to bring in these conversations is, what can we do as citizens, whether we're tired, because some of us are working extremely hard in multiple jobs. So Lawson, I know you're going to be engaged in this conversation, but I wanted to thank you for that presentation. And great job. And we are so lucky, like I said, one of the hardest working people in this state, Representative Chandra Dillard. We are so blessed, and I mean that, blessed to have her as our leader in Greenville. You heard some of Lawson's presentations, Representative Dillard. Talk to us about your experience when you first got elected. That was one of the first things you did kind of in 2010. So walk our participants through that process and what you feel are some of the highlights you want to bring to their attention.
Well, thank you so much, Eli. And it's always a pleasure to join Lawson. She is the lady with all the information. And so we appreciate having her be with us. But I will tell you that the reality of redistricting, and yes, this will be my third redistricting. So I had one on city council, and I was brand spanking new. In 2000, we received that data, and then 2010 for the State House, and then here we are again. So it's always seems like a year after I'm new. So I'm not new now. I get to do this one with a little bit more experience, but the data changes and it still makes it very, very challenging. And I believe it is going to be challenging. So from the legislative perspective, let me just say that we have not received the data, but we are looking forward to receiving the data. By congressional law and statute, states are supposed to receive the data by April 1st. But we have already seen a report just this week that there are some anomalies in the data that are coming out of the Census Bureau, which means they're going to try to correct that, and that could push just a little past the April 1st deadline. And I am hoping if these anomalies, they aren't saying exactly why and what the anomaly is, but I am hoping we will have a new president. And if that data is not what we think it should be, I hope he will give them time before we receive the data. So that's very important. So we'll get the data around April 1st. We're going to say we're going to have it. And at that time, it comes into the South Carolina Office of Revenue and Fiscal Affairs. They receive the data. They look at it to see if it matches some of the on-the-ground work and the data that we have from a tax and physical standpoint. And then the data comes to House members and Senate members. So as Lawson said, House members get to draw their districts and senators get to draw their districts. And so this year, we are looking at an expected new population of 5.2 million people in South Carolina. We are the 10th fastest growing state in the nation. Yay, South Carolina, but that's going to create some interesting dynamics as far as redistricting. So we're looking at now perhaps every House seat having 41,000 residents and every Senate seat having 113,000 residents. And so with that, we've already recognized that there are some very fast growing areas in the state, like the upstate and the low country, but then we are losing population or have lost population in the middle of the state, which again is going to be a challenge. So for me, we know how fast Greenville is growing, right? And we've seen the growth has been exponential. So my district could contract, but I still have all those other levels of criteria to meet with African-American voters and trying to make sure that we still have representation because as Lawson told you earlier, it's okay. As a matter of fact, the voting rights says it's okay and that minority representation should be taken into effect. But so we'll try to move forward from there. So I will tell you that redistricting is just like any other bill. It starts when we go into the individual member goes into the map room. We go in along with a demographer. We hire our own demographers and look at this data. And we will be receiving around 180,000 census blocks down to the block that we'll go in and look at our districts. And so with that, then the map, just goes through a subcommittee process and there will be public hearings across the state. Lawson alluded to that. And I hope when that panel comes to Greenville last 10 years, we were very fortunate to have our then Representative Carl Allen as a part of the judiciary be a part of that process and that panel that went across and throughout the state to listen to the constituents of South Carolina and get their input. And so I hope that we will have a continued great leadership, or maybe he will be on the panel again. But that gives the public time to weigh in, goes through the full committee, and then it goes on the floor. And so just like any other bill, and so someone had asked me earlier, was there a deadline? Well, South Carolina is one of the states that constitutionally or by statute does not have a deadline. But our deadline is always before the next primary. So for us would be June 2022 would be our deadline to get our maps correct. Everybody's feeling good, and we can implement those plans. And I'll stop there in case you have some more questions.
No, Representative Dillard, that's so informative. And one of the things that I really appreciate that you do, and that both you and Lawson pointed out, is that majority minority districts serve a great purpose. Some of the greatest representatives that we have across the country, like Representative John Lewis, might not have been in existence if there wasn't districts drawn for him. So I really appreciate the fact that you're highlighting that. And I'm going to brag on you. You are someone that wants a competitive seat, that could run up your district, but chooses to make sure that you have a majority representation of African Americans so that they have a voice, but you also make sure that you're being fair to the larger community. And I really wish we had more people like you that went into that room thinking like you did versus how Lawson's presentation presents it, because I do think a lot of the representatives and the senators that we have try to protect their seats, unfortunately. One question I want to talk to you. I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead, Eli. Continue.
No. The one question that I just wanted to ask you is talk about how that information gets passed down to the city council, to the county council, and then how they inform how they draw their lines.
Well, okay. Well, after the House and the Senate, we draw our lines. And by the way, we draw congressional lines as well. I don't know if people know that, but it's up to Congress to tell a state if they have earned a congressional seat. So we don't create congressional seats just because we say, oh, well, you know, South Carolina, we've got 5.2 million people now. We think we deserve another congressional seat. It is actually Congress who tells us if we've earned a seat, but we do get to draw that seat. So after that process, that same data is trickled down to local government. So cities and towns, they draw their own lines. The county councils draw their own lines. And in certain cases, the legislature does draw school district lines. Me and Trustee Glenda Morrison Fair were talking about this, and because of the size of Greenville County, we believe, we could not recall, but we believe that they draw their own lines because they aren't under legislative delegation. We still have some school districts in the state of South Carolina that their school board members are appointed by the delegation. So those delegations get to draw their school board lines. But it makes it a lot easier when we start and then the other government levels follow, because in Greenville, I will tell you, my House district, District 23, resembles very much County Council District 23, because basically, you know, we've done the work. And so we know where the people are. And so as you go on down, and then city council has to look at one side and then the other side. And so, which is going to be a tough hill to climb this year, because Greenville, the dynamics have changed so much to retain those two minority seats that are on Greenville City Council. And it's not going to be a walk in the park for me either. So, but I look forward to the process and the challenge.
Absolutely. You're always up for the challenge. And I didn't mean to interrupt you as well, to your earlier point, if you wanted to make that as well, because I know we have eager people that want to ask some questions too. So if there's anything else you'd like to share about the process of redistricting at this point, and then we'll open it up to kind of a dialogue for you and Lawson.
Okay. Well, you know, I just want, you know, the legislature, we also need to set the criteria for the redistricting so that we will have fair rules and expectations when each of us walk into the map room. And some of those might be understanding what is a minority district. You know, we all need to have that understanding. Again, the Voting Rights Act says it's okay, and it says we must take race into consideration. But the 14th Amendment says that it cannot be the only thing. And that's when you get into packing. So it's a fine line. You know, you need to have minority representation. And also the criteria is that, you know, I can't go backwards in the numbers. I should not be able to go backwards and lose what we already have. So again, just criteria. You know, how do we define communities of interest? Is it everybody that goes to a certain school? Or, you know, what is it that's the defining thing on the ground that makes a community of interest? Are we going to minimize splitting precincts? You know, so as we look at voting patterns, we know those are communities of interest, right? Because we do precinct reorganization. So we still need to look at some of the criteria. And I do think that some of the challenges we're going to face here in South Carolina are, the federal government no longer requires pre-clearance on southern states. But we are hopeful. Can President Biden enact some things when he becomes president, even at this point, to give this a little bit more transparency and some fairness? So I understand at higher levels, there's talk about bringing that back, but will it be enough time to do that? But right now, we don't have that. So that may be a little problematic to us. I talked about the impacts of gentrification on drawing minority districts, and also lawsuits by outside groups. If we draw lines and maps that are not consistent with our criteria or good for the people to have their votes counted, then I expect lawsuits. Our very own Trav Roberts visited the House Democratic Caucus this week, and we talked on Tuesday as a body, House Democrats and Trav, about this process. And he said he is fully prepared to bring a lawsuit if it does not maintain the opportunity, in this case, for Democrats to have their votes counted. So these are the things that could prolong or complicate, and I'm sure there's probably some things that I haven't even mentioned, but I do hope that people will be vigilant in this process. Check in when you can, talk to your legislators. When that map comes to Greenville, let's be there, let's be informed. We have Lawson to inform us, and let's have our voices counted in this process.
Awesome. Thank you, Representative Dillard. And I want to, Lawson, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, I want to kind of pivot to that point that Representative Dillard made, that roadshow, kind of when they decide in the committee that this is what they're going to go with and they move around the state. What are some things that you've seen in the past? What kind of input can we have as citizens? What can we do at those events?
So I'm a newbie on this one. Some of the many ways in which Representative's experience and wisdom far exceed mine is her experience with doing this process historically. But I do know that they're required to have public hearings, as she had mentioned, that they are required to come around. And so, when I think about a lot of these things is things can go in very different ways depending on how much energy people put into them, right? So was anybody here a part of when the utility companies were trying to raise rates and they had a public hearing about it, and it was like this was pre-COVID, it was standing room only, everybody, it was such a great example of a lot of people really cared and spoke with their feet and showed up and made a real difference. So you figure when these roadshows happen, a lot of how it's going to go is going to depend on, is it in some, council room at county council that nobody really shows up to and it's all kind of pro forma and, rubber stampy, or do people show up and, are prepared and make a difference? So I think how it goes can depend a lot on how we as citizens interact with it, prepare for it, pay attention to it.
Excellent point.
And Eli, I'm so sorry. Yeah. I'm so sorry. Can I not jump in on one point that one thing that I just wanted to add on to sort of underscore and springboard off of something that Representative Dillard was talking about. This point about majority and minority districts, I cannot emphasize enough. So the reason why we have those Voting Rights Act protections is because there is, I'm sure a lot of people in this room right now know, a long, consistent, ugly history of disenfranchising populations from the vote through doing district lines, right? So it's the reason why there are these protections is to move against the historic oppression. Just as one of many, many examples, when the states like South Carolina were trying to disenfranchise Black voters, one of the strategies that they did was to try to make voting be done based on single like at-large seats, right? They were sort of maneuvering district lines so that you would not have a community of interest representing the Black community with a chance to get a seat. And if you look at it right now, there still is, I think we all know that we are about to see a wave of attempted vote suppression. And right under the cover of, we're trying to fix election fraud, right? We are about to see a lot of attempts to disenfranchise a lot of people. And one of those ways can be through redistricting. And bear in mind, because we currently do have a relatively strong alignment between political partisan positions and racial categories, if partisan gerrymandering is permitted, essentially you can sneak racist, gerrymandering under cover of that. Like, oh, well, we're not trying to be against a racial group. We're just trying to disenfranchise a political party. But same difference and same effect. So I just wanted to highlight there is a long and ugly history that supports why it's so important to have majority minority districts. And I'm thankful that we have them.
One thing I really appreciate, Lawson, that you said is the voter suppression aspect. I think so many times we think about it on the back end, where we're disenfranchising people or preventing them to get to the polls, but this is an early issue and an early way that people stifle people's participation or their motivation. And I really appreciate the way that you couch that. And so many times here, because our seats are so gerrymandered, we go unchallenged and we become comfortable with, okay, this is the only person that we have. We're not going to challenge them because they're okay enough. But when it comes to the votes like drawing fair lines, where are these folks going to stand? And I think so many of us on this call have gotten to the point where we know we have to back folks that are going to promote non-discriminatory policies and promote more voter engagement and less voter suppression. And what we see oftentimes in our state house, specifically the Republicans, it's always to disenfranchise, always to demotivate folks, especially communities of color. Representative Dillard, you had mentioned something, and you talk about the rules and the statutes and the goals is to get it in place by 2022. Outside of the Judiciary Committee, how much input do you, as one of 124 members, how much do you have in the overall process?
Well, again, I tell you, it begins like any other legislative process, except for this time. Essentially, if my district is what I want, if my district, when I go in, look at District 23 and say, this is what I think is best for District 23 moving forward for the next 10 years based on the data, based on the criteria that we have set as a body. That's almost like my little amendment to the big bill, right? Okay. But I will have to continue to work with my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. And it's so important. We have a subcommittee on election law. A whole subcommittee on that. So, we do have some strong folks on there, but they're going to have to fight like heck. That's just, I'm not sugarcoating it, to be very astute and alert, because things change on a dime with redistricting. Once I leave the room, if I don't go back and look at it, it could have changed, because it's like dominoes. One thing moves, something else happens. And it can get very contentious. Last 10 years, we lost some folks, again, in the Midlands, where they're decreasing population. They pitted two legislators, happened to be two Democrats. They were forced to run against each other, and one come out the winner. Mean things like that, to say we're not going to keep both these districts that you represent. So, you're going to have to run against each other. And we tried to fight against that. We did not have the wherewithal to overcome those votes. But it's all kind of maneuvering. And so being abreast, and maybe that's what we need to be as Democrats. So as this process unfolds, we need to know what the criteria is. And when we see it
Yeah.
in public, we need to call it out.
Yeah, and Curtis asked you, put a great comment in the chat about kind of understanding exactly your point, Representative Dillard, being informed, making sure this is where we understand where the conversation is starting, so then we know where to apply pressure. And I think you gave us some really great points on where that pressure can be applied. One question I want to kick to Lawson from Tommy is, what's the best way to bring informed consent or dissent to these roadshows? And I know that you said you're kind of a newbie, but your blog that you mentioned, are there other resources? And I know we're going to give that great one pager we're going to share. What are some resources that you can talk about fair maps, or the best way to look at them?
So I would suggest this. I think the best thing that you can do is connect with an organization or a group, right, that is organizing in those things. So I know, for example, the League of Women Voters, you know, for those of you who are on Facebook, personally, I'm trying to cut that cord, but for those who are on Facebook, following League of Women Voters South Carolina on Facebook, I know that they're going to be organizing events, including training, to exactly that point of sort of what's a way to make your voice heard at those. And so I would recommend some combination of connect with a group that is involved already in doing something like that, so that you can get, I know for me, you know, we can't all be experts in everything. It's helpful to identify, you know, someone to follow in certain things, and this may be one of them for some people. And beyond that, I mean, I think it's probably more just common sense than anything. Honestly, you know, it's like, are you going to show up and be prepared or not prepared? But I think connecting with an organization is the best tip I would give there.
Excellent. And I'm going to jump around because I know questions are coming in kind of as we type. Representative Dillard, Amy has a great question. We don't classify ourselves or register by party here. And we have open primaries. So what are some of the things that you look at to draw boundaries in addition to race when you're looking at your map specifically?
Well, I look at, well, and I think we all do it. Again, we started talking about communities of interest. And precinct lines, you know, neighborhoods. Do we split a neighborhood? To me, that's a community of interest. And, you know, so, you know, it's one thing to get the data, but when you're in the map room and I can zero down on the street, if you know, each of us should know our districts really well. You know, maybe it's an apartment complex that needs to, you know, come over, but there all kinds of things. But I will tell you, no, we do not. The census is not partisan. The 180,000 census blocks are not partisan. But we can look at voting records. We don't. You know, maybe the folks on the other side do, and that may not be for us to do at that time. We can't do that in the map room, but that's a part of being a representative, knowing the people in your district. If you move around pretty well in your district, you kind of know what the communities of interest are, and try not to divide those folks.
It's a great point. Dean, I like how you prefaced your question, a newbie question. And Lawson, I'm going to kick this one to you. Dean, it's actually a great question. I don't think it's a newbie one. Dean says, I'm near Judson and wondered how the controversial census will affect the heavily Latino area in question, because he knows some of them are off-putting. Some of the questions are off-putting. Some Latinos will come forward and respond. So any insight on how that will affect his area in his community or the larger Greenville area?
I would love to answer that one. And also, is it okay? I see a question from Peggy Schotch right above it that I have an easy answer to. So I'm gonna do a two for. Okay, Dean, thank you so much for the question. So the reason why it was really important for the census to get a full fair count of all residents, right? It's not a count of citizens, it's a count of residents. Was primarily for public services, by the way, right? I mean, that's what decides how many hospitals, how many this. So P.S., one of the worst consequences that flows from an undercount is that you get inadequate services in your neighborhood, right? It also means that those people, when people are drawing lines based on equal population, there's those missing people. So the district lines are going to be distorted in that kind of a way. So And as I imagine the people in this room know, but I don't know how much you're paying attention, typically the census is not a politicized project. The 2020 census, in which there was talk of adding citizenship questions and approaches that were clearly designed to try to get an undercount, especially of certain populations, is abhorrent and unusual, and knock on wood, let's as citizens make sure it's true, should never happen again. But I think those are the primary consequences, are you're going to get distorted lines and insufficient services, and it's terrible. Peggy Shotchet, hey Peggy, said that she understands the importance of majority-minority districts, but how do we avoid diluting minority participation by putting those folks all in one district? Great question. The answer is that you can do things with a priority on maximizing the number of majority-minority districts. Right? It's the assessment of what does it take to, give, again, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, language minorities, a solid, a real meaningful opportunity to elect someone of their choice. And I'm now going to drop in the chat one of my favorite little dorky things, which is a site that is a redistricting atlas, where you can go on and play around with what are some ways to draw lines in South Carolina. That includes, if you want to maximize Republican representation, maximize Democratic representation, and one of the tabs is if you want to maximize majority-minority districts. So you do not have to pack districts in order to facilitate majority-minority representation.
Yeah, I asked that question because in Arizona, I guess they have 9 congressional districts, and 3 of them are protected. And the remaining 6 are, the population is majority Republican. And so the commission that was assigned to redistrict decided that those remaining 6 would be split evenly, Republican and Democrat. And that caused a whole lot of hoopla. So sometimes our protected districts are, I won't say they're a problem, but they complicate things.
No, that's a great point, Peggy. I think, and this is no disrespect to our wonderful congressman, but we look at the 6th congressional district. There's a lot of minorities packed into Congressman Clyburn's district. That's not all Congressman Clyburn's fault. That's other people doing that. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to, is it does hurt surrounding area because of the competitiveness. And I think that's a wonderful point that you brought up. I want to ask Representative Dillard a question from Amanda McDougald-Scott. She was asking, is there any way that you think the Biden administration will allow some more time for the census to be counted correctly, so that we're not dealing with those anomalies that you mentioned?
Well, I don't know if he will allow more counting, but we are hopeful that he will allow a time to deal with those anomalies. Again, we received that kind of news flash this week, and I started researching for today's conversation with you, and I can't find anywhere. As a matter of fact, my source said that they have not been revealed, but just in my normal course of work this week at the State House, we talked about perhaps with the change of administration, he knows, President-elect Biden knows that many people were not given a fair shot. The census itself was not given a fair shot this year. I mean, less advertising, shorter turnaround of time. It is within his wherewithal to do something about that before we get the data. And let me just say, I would certainly welcome that, but I do know that creates a hardship too for those states that have statutes on the books, and there are several of them, and by constitution, that talk about their redistricting guidelines. So again, the census itself is not political, but certainly sometimes the process is very political.
Absolutely.
But I hope he will. And I hope he can. Certainly he can, but I hope he will.
Excellent. One question I wanted to ask Lawson is, can you talk about, and you alluded to it in your presentation, go in a little more depth about why we can't be like North Carolina. And you and I, when we initially talked, you talked about everything going through the legislature. Talk a little bit about the reason North Carolina gets state envy sometimes, and we look at these other states. So if you don't mind talking to the group about that and share your insight.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one thing that is frustrating. South Carolina, I love this state so much, but one thing that's frustrating is we have way more limited, our state constitution gives us an unusually strong legislature and an unusually weak governor. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. It's based in racism, but at any rate, that's a whole bigger topic. But it's just the case that our state legislature has given itself a tremendous amount of power. And it includes, we as voters don't have as many opportunities to weigh in. So, again, there's so many states where, a citizens group can put a referendum up for vote and can, just get on the vote without having to go through the state legislature, where you can push for a constitutional amendment, where you can count on your state court system to, find the right for you in your state constitution. And right now in South Carolina, that's just not none of those are options. All roads have to go through the state legislature, except for the possibility of the federal government stepping in to help, with Congress and the incoming Biden administration.
No, that's one of the frustrating things. And one of the things that Lawson really set me straight on was, yes, ultimately, we do want to change the law. But right now, that's the most futile process we can go through. I think Lawson has really helped me see, and Representative Dillard as well, helped me see where we need to focus our energies. And Curtis, we definitely are going to have a follow-up. Lawson, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you here, but I know you are always willing to join. But we want to make sure that we're giving y'all information. And Curtis, I know how data is important to you and how you use it to inform yourself. So we definitely want to make sure that we're opening this up. We'll get together and huddle as a leadership team and talk about when we can have a subsequent follow-up with that. I do want to make sure that everyone is getting their questions answered. Tommy wrote, it's fun to note that the 538 redistricting map Lawson shared, the current boundaries map is gerrymandered to favor Republicans map are the exact same. Go figure. What is a realistic target that could be better that we can go for the short term? To Tommy's question.
Representative Dillard?
Wow. I just think that, and I want to make sure I understand your question. You're asking me what can we do in the short term?
Yes, yeah, Tommy would say, what's the best thing in the short term to get away from those maps that we see that are gerrymandered towards Republicans?
Well, I think that we will need to hold them accountable. Again, just like any other subject, legislative subject that's important to us. We need to wear their phones out. We need to show up at those public hearings that are going to take place across the state. We can form coalitions with like-minded people. And I believe that we don't do that enough in South Carolina. Why should Greenville have to fight the issue alone if we see our lines going awry? I can almost guarantee you it's probably happening in Charleston as well. And what are those local activist groups that are on the line, on the ground that can help us if we all speak the same language and at the same time on this subject? So we're going to have to be very creative. There needs to be a lot of conversation and dialogue between elected officials and the community. 10 years ago, the elected officials, I was joined by elected officials. We were able to bring in an expert organization from North Carolina, and we had over 100 people at a forum. I have been in contact with them, just to educate people. North Carolina they have a lot more what I call activist organizations in this arena, in the civil rights arena. we are missing that in South Carolina. But working together, collaborating, speaking with one voice, and showing up.
If I may add something to that as well, because the way that I've been expressing this, like it has to go through the State House, and the State House is exactly who doesn't want it to happen, right? It makes it sound very doom and gloomy. And I can promise you, like, I'm not about wasting my time. I would not be focusing on this issue if I thought it was inevitably doom and gloomy. So the downside of pushing for redistricting reform is exactly what we've already talked about, that the people with the power to make the change are the people whose self-interest is not to change it, right? That's the weak part of where we are. The strong part of where we are is that the people, the citizens here, are an absolute sleeping dragon on this issue. If you poll people, voters in South Carolina, everywhere, a substantial majority of people across party lines do not like gerrymandering, right? It does not, it's against voters' self-interest, and voters know it, really know it. And so the power that we have is the power of shining a light, and frankly, the power of shame. If you put a microphone in someone's face and say, hey, explain to me why you just drew your lines to cut your upcoming challenger out of your district, and there's a camera in their face, what are they going to say? If you put a microphone and a camera in someone's face and say, you won your last election by 30 points, why are you drawing your lines to make that happen again? Shouldn't your voters get a real choice next time? Right? We have that power, but it requires, as Representative Dillard said, it requires us to come together and speak, right, and represent. The sleeping dragon needs to wake up and act.
Yes, absolutely. We had some great questions that came in previously, and I'm going to get to those, but Ms. Jean just asked a question that I want to ask. If things are already mapped optimally for a Republican, any change will, it wasn't even a question, it was just a statement, and I love your statement. If things are already mapped optimally for a Republican, any change will improve things. Yes, they will. Nowhere to go but up. Ms. Jean, I am with you. I love that. Curtis, South Carolina picked up the seat in the last cycle, but it's not to, yes, I think there is some conversation. A lot of people are leaving some northern states, New York, seeing a lot of exodus. I don't know if we will actually get a congressional seat, but as Representative Dillard said, Congress will appropriate based on population, and that will affect how many congressional seats we will get if we get an extra one. One question that was asked, and I want Lawson, if you want to take this one, and then Representative Dillard, you can follow up. One of our really great Democrats in Greenville wants to understand why the Anderson representative, Jeff Duncan's area, comes up on White Horse Road. Why do we not have local representation? And I think I'll start with, I think that's just, we can only have so many people in Greenville in Congressional District 4 because we're sharing it with Spartanburg, because they're two of the largest cities in the state. So a part of our community, especially the southern half, is in that Congressional District 3. But Lawson, am I kind of stating that the wrong way, or?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, so you figure if we are, and I know folks had asked, and Curtis in the chat had answered, questions about apportionment, right, which is happening right now, where Congress, and which Representative Dillard referred to earlier, about where Congress decides how many seats we get in the U.S. House and whether we're going to go up from 7 to 8 or not. Let's assume we stay at 7. If we get 7 seats, there's only so many ways to divvy up 7 districts, and that whole idea of sort of what we consider to be our home turf, for local versus not local, is going to depend for people anyway. And as Eli mentioned, the district that I live in, so I live in Greenville. I'm in U.S. House District 4, which is held by William Timmons, and it straddles Greenville and Spartanburg. So it's sort of what's local for that. I don't know that answers the question, but I do think that another thing, I'm going to flip back to the little page that I did about what the margins of victory were. So Jeff Duncan won with a almost 43% margin of victory. So one way of answering that question is, whoa, like that's drawn to be as Republican as you can get.
Yeah.
And Eli, if I may add something to that conversation. So, when 10 years ago, and I want to give a shout out to Curtis Askew, we went through a very robust grassroots campaign, signing petitions. You know, we had the data to try to keep Greenville County, all of Greenville County, in the 4th Congressional District. But that would have meant sacrificing part of Spartanburg. But we do see Greenville and Spartanburg as communities of interest, because we have been talking for a long time about regionalism. And you see that we are now beginning to act as a region. So we had some choices to make when it came to this. And so some of us felt like all of Greenville County should have stayed whole. We did not want to see parts of Greenville County go into the 3rd Congressional District. Well, Spartanburg legislators didn't want Spartanburg split up. You know, they could sacrifice Cherokee County, but these are the exact conversations and where grassroots knowledge comes to play. And we did a heck of a job as a community filing our petition. It did not realize the results that we wanted to have. See, Curtis agrees with me. And so, but it was worth the exercise. People were informed about what was happening. And so we're going to have that again. We probably will have that dilemma again, because again, I saw the redistricting map. I mean, not the redistricting map, but I saw the growth points on the South Carolina map. And I will tell you, all along the I-85 corridor, we are busting at the seams all along Charleston. And so as we begin to change, that's going to move down. And so maybe we'll have a chance to constrict Greenville County and get us back together, because we have more population inside Greenville County. Could be a possibility, but those are the things we have to look for.
Excellent. And Curtis, we're definitely going to be calling on you for your knowledge as well when we get into this process. I want to open it up to anyone else to ask any other questions for our esteemed panelists. I learn from them every time I talk to them, so I've learned more here on this call. So please feel free to open up, unmute yourself, and ask a question if you have. All right, I don't see any right now. I know that this was such a valuable time to talk. We know at the GCDP, we want to lead conversations to action. So we are going to be coming up with a checklist, and a lot of the checklist is going to be taking pieces that Lawson and the amazing work that the members of the League of Women Voters are doing, not only here in Greenville, but across the state. One of my favorite quotes, I won't read it here, but I read, was from a woman that I didn't even know was associated with the League from Columbia. So just the foresight and the work that they're doing is brilliant. And I'm not about reinventing the wheel. If someone is already doing the work, like Lawson said, let's partner with them. Let's get behind them, because we know when we're locked arms, it's always better and always stronger. I want to start by thanking some people that I see on the call, members of my leadership team. So again, our first Vice Chair, Ruth Todd, second Vice Chair, Sharon Garrett, our awesome volunteer coordinator, Stacy Mars, our Candidate Development Committee, Amanda McDougall-Scott, our amazing multi-hat wearing Anita LeBold, who is our amazing alternate executive committee woman and has been the treasurer forever and does so much for our party. But I also want to thank Evelyn Nocella, the new president of the North Greenville Democrats, and Matt Cazasus, the president of the South Greenville Democrats, and also the esteemed Ingrid Irwin, who served our party in the state executive committee. And I just love seeing her face. And I want to thank you, Ingrid, for everything you still do for our party. I really appreciate that. Absolutely. And most importantly, Laura Haight, who keeps me straight. She makes sure that I'm on task. She works with our communications. She works with our technology, and she is a great teammate to have in our party. Thank you all. Thank you, Representative Dillard, for everything that you do. Thank you, Lawson. Y'all are amazing. We really appreciate your time. And let's keep pushing, y'all. We see so much opportunity with the election of the new president and our amazing vice president. We're going to be positive. we're going to continue to push our values, and we're going to continue to stay in this fight as patriots, but as amazing Democrats as we always are. With that, I bid you all farewell. Stay safe. Please wear your mask. Think of others. And I look forward to seeing you all soon.